The German women laughed in disbelief as the strange yellow loaf was placed before them. "This is not bread," they exclaimed. Their prisoner of war status doing nothing to diminish their culinary pride. Yet something unexpected happened when the first reluctant bite of American cornbread touched their tongues. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. October 1944 arrived with a biting chill that swept across the Iowa plains, rattling the dried corn husks surrounding Camp Alona. The train screeched to a halt, its metal wheels grinding against the tracks as 12 German women prisoners stepped onto American soil. Greta Hoffman clutched her thin coat tighter, her eyes, once accustomed to guiding students through lessons in Hamburg, now carefully assessing their new reality. Barbed wire glinted in the morning light, forming a silver cage around what would be their home for the foreseeable future. The American soldiers stood with rifles at their sides, faces impassive, yet not overtly hostile. Greta instinctively positioned herself at the front of her group, a protective gesture that had become habit during their long journey across the Atlantic. "Stay together," she whispered in German to Liesel Wagner, the youngest of their group. The girl nodded, her wide eyes taking in everything with a mixture of fear and undisguised curiosity. To their collective surprise, the camp itself defied their grim expectations. The barracks, though sparse, were clean and dry. Each woman received a blanket and a small pillow, luxuries they hadn't anticipated after months of wartime scarcity. "This way, ladies," called an American woman in crisp English, gesturing toward the mess hall. Margaret Sullivan, the camp director, carried herself with quiet authority, her clipboard tucked under one arm as she guided the newcomers through the facility. Unlike the guards, her expression held neither suspicion nor disdain, but rather a measured professionalism. "You will eat 3 times daily," she explained, speaking slowly for their benefit. "Work assignments begin tomorrow." The mess hall buzzed with muted conversation as the women filed in, the scent of hot food drawing them forward after days of meager rations during transport. Steam rose from the serving counter where Sam Washington, a tall man with capable hands, stood ladling something onto metal trays. When Greta received her portion, she stared down at the golden yellow squares beside the beans and potatoes. It was nothing like the dense, dark bread of home. She poked at it with her fork, its spongy texture yielding easily. "Was ist das?" whispered Liesel, sniffing at the unfamiliar food. A ripple of uncertain laughter spread among the German women as they examined the strange offering. The sound echoed through the mess hall, drawing curious glances from the American personnel. Greta took a tentative bite, the sweetness unexpected on her tongue. The texture was soft, crumbly, nothing like the substantial rye loaves that had sustained her family for generations. "It's not even bread," she remarked in German, unaware that her words would soon take on significance far beyond this first meal in a foreign land. Greta Hoffman held the square of golden yellow bread between her slender fingers, examining it with the critical eye of someone who had grown up with dense, dark German rye. The texture was all wrong, too light, too spongy, and the color resembled nothing she'd ever called bread before. She brought it to her nose, inhaling the sweet, unfamiliar aroma. "Es ist nicht einmal Brot," she muttered, before switching to her practiced English. "It's not even bread," she declared loudly enough for the other women to hear, her lips curling into a dismissive smirk. The mess hall echoed with laughter as the other German women seized on her assessment. Liesel Wagner, barely 20 and the youngest of their group, giggled and poked at her own piece with theatrical suspicion. "Perhaps it is cake," Liesel suggested in halting English, her blue eyes dancing with mischief. "American cake for prisoners? How generous!" Her exaggerated bow of gratitude sent another wave of laughter through the group. Another woman tore her piece in half, watching the crumbs scatter across the metal tray. "So dry, like eating sweet sand," she complained, though she continued eating despite her criticism. None of them noticed Sam Washington standing just beyond the serving counter, a fresh tray of cornbread in his weathered hands. The cook froze, his expression carefully neutral, even as their words cut deep. This cornbread was more than just food. It was heritage. His grandmother had taught him to make it during times when wheat flour was too expensive for black families in Alabama. The recipe had sustained his family through the worst of the Depression, a point of pride and survival. Sam placed the tray down quietly and turned away, his shoulders slightly hunched. He'd spent extra time on this batch, hoping to make the foreign women feel welcome with something warm and filling. Instead, their mockery transported him back to Montgomery, to all the times his contributions had been diminished with a casual word or glance. At the far end of the mess hall, Margaret Sullivan observed the scene with concern. The camp director noticed how the American guards' expressions hardened as they overheard the women's derision. One soldier, who had been about to sit near the German prisoners, chose another table entirely. Greta, still smiling at her own joke, took another bite of the cornbread. Despite her criticism, hunger won out. She didn't see how Sam disappeared into the kitchen, nor how the American soldiers exchanged glances. She couldn't know that her casual dismissal of something so simple as bread would create a rift that would take weeks to bridge. Liesel, more observant than her older companion, caught the change in atmosphere. Her laughter faded as she noticed the cook's retreat. For just a moment, she wondered if perhaps they had misunderstood something important about this strange yellow bread and the people who had offered it. The morning after the cornbread incident, the mess hall carried an unusual silence. Greta Hoffman noticed it immediately. The stiffness in the guards' shoulders, the absence of their awkward but well-intentioned German phrases. Where Private Miller had previously greeted them with a cheerful Guten Morgen, he now merely nodded curtly, eyes fixed somewhere above their heads. "They're different today," Liesel whispered, sliding her tray alongside Greta's in the breakfast line. The young woman's perceptiveness never ceased to impress Greta, though she wouldn't admit it. "Perhaps they're tired," Greta replied, but she knew better. Something had shifted, like a door quietly closing. Sam Washington worked behind the serving counter, his movements efficient and precise. Gone was the warm smile he'd offered just yesterday, replaced by a mask of professional detachment. When Greta extended her tray, he served her without meeting her eyes, without the morning ladies that had become part of their daily routine. By midday, the chill had spread throughout Camp Alona. The guards patrolled with renewed formality, addressing the women only when necessary, their instructions clipped and direct. Even Margaret Sullivan, typically warm despite her authority, seemed more reserved during her afternoon inspection of the barracks. "What has happened?" Helga, one of the older women, asked during their afternoon work detail. "They act as if we've committed some new offense." Greta shook her head, watching as two guards conversed nearby, their voices low, occasionally glancing toward the German women with expressions she couldn't quite read. Was it disappointment? Resentment? That evening, as they gathered in their barracks, Greta felt the weight of isolation settling over them like a heavy blanket. The camp, already a place of confinement, now seemed doubly so, a prison within a prison, where even small comforts of human connection had been withdrawn. "Perhaps they've received bad news from the front," suggested another prisoner, folding her thin blanket with precise corners. "No," Greta said quietly. "I think it was something we did." She recalled the laughter that had rippled through their group at the mess hall, the dismissive comments about the strange yellow bread. At the time, it had seemed harmless, a moment of shared amusement in their bleak circumstances. Now, she wondered if they had inadvertently crossed an invisible line. As darkness fell over the Iowa cornfields surrounding the camp, Greta stood at the small window, watching the guards change shifts. The distance between them and their captors had always been measured in more than just yards of barbed wire, but now it felt vast and unbridgeable. The teacher in her recognized the lesson forming. In this strange land, even bread could carry meaning beyond sustenance. The problem was, she didn't yet understand what that meaning might be. The knock on her door was gentle but firm, just like Margaret Sullivan herself. The camp director looked up from her paperwork, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses as she called for the visitor to enter. "You wanted to see me?" Greta Hoffman stood in the doorway, her posture straight, but her eyes betraying uncertainty. "Yes, please come in and have a seat," Margaret replied, gesturing to the wooden chair across from her desk. The office was simple but organized. Much like everything else at Camp Alona. Greta sat down, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The tension in the camp had been palpable since the Cornbread incident, and she suspected this summons was related. "I've noticed some difficulties between your group and our staff," Margaret began diplomatically. Her voice carried the measured tone of someone accustomed to navigating delicate situations. "Small misunderstandings can grow into larger problems if we don't address them." "We have done nothing wrong," Greta replied defensively, though her voice lacked conviction. Margaret smiled slightly. "This isn't about right or wrong, Miss Hoffman. It's about understanding." She leaned forward, her elbows resting on the desk. "The incident in the mess hall may seem trivial to you, but food carries deep meaning for many Americans, especially those like Sam who come from the South." Greta's eyes widened slightly at this revelation. "I have a proposition," the camp director continued. "Would you be willing to lead English lessons for your fellow prisoners? Not just vocabulary, but American customs and expressions too." Greta's pride bristled at first. She was a prisoner, not a teacher anymore. Yet as she considered the offer, she recognized the opportunity it presented. "And why would I do this?" she asked, though her tone had softened. "Because understanding is the first step toward peace," Margaret answered simply. "Both here in this small camp and in the larger world we'll all return to someday." Greta sat silently for a moment, weighing her options. The other women looked to her for guidance, and lately, that guidance had led them into isolation. Perhaps this was a chance to protect them from further missteps. "Very well," she finally agreed, her voice quiet but resolute. "I will teach them, but I will need materials, books perhaps." Margaret nodded, relief visible in her features. "I'll arrange everything." And Greta? She used the first name intentionally. "This isn't surrender. It's adaptation. Sometimes that's the greatest strength we can show." As the former schoolteacher rose to leave, she felt something unexpected, a flicker of purpose she hadn't experienced since before her capture. Perhaps in teaching others, she might regain not just respect from the Americans, but something of herself as well. The evenings at Camp Alona took on a new rhythm as November settled in. After dinner, Greta Hoffman would clear her throat and gather the women in the corner of Barracks 3, where a small blackboard had been provided by Margaret Sullivan. The former schoolteacher found herself slipping back into familiar patterns, though teaching English to fellow prisoners was hardly what she had imagined for herself. "Today we learn useful phrases," she announced in German, before switching to careful English. "Please, thank you. Where is the—" Her chalk scratched against the board, the sound mingling with the women's hesitant repetitions. Liesl Wagner sat cross-legged on her bunk, absorbing words like a sponge. "Please pass the cornbread," she practiced with exaggerated politeness, earning chuckles from the others. The young woman's natural curiosity made her an eager student, often staying after the informal lessons to ask Greta about American expressions she'd overheard from the guards. "What means 'hold your horses'?" Liesl asked one evening. "Guard Miller says this to Guard Thompson yesterday." Greta frowned, consulting her growing vocabulary list. "I believe it means to be patient," she replied, the words feeling strange on her tongue. Soon the barracks echoed with attempts at American idioms. "Hold your horses! In a jiffy! You're pulling my leg!" The phrases became inside jokes, passed between the women as they worked or ate, creating moments of unexpected joy in their confinement. During one session, Margaret arrived with a newspaper, pointing to headlines and teaching the women to decipher American reporting. The director's patience impressed Greta, who found herself studying not just the words, but the way Margaret formed them, the soft Midwestern vowels, so different from their German accents. Listen to the music of it, Greta instructed her companions. English dances differently than our language. Through these sessions, the women began absorbing more than vocabulary. They learned that Americans nodded instead of bowing slightly, that direct eye contact was expected rather than considered challenging, that personal space was measured differently. Small cultural revelations accumulated like snowflakes on the windowsill. One evening, a guard brought in a radio for 30 minutes. The women huddled around it, straining to understand the rapid-fire English of a news broadcast. Though much was lost, the familiar names of European cities connected them momentarily to the world beyond the barbed wire. "I understand Paris," exclaimed one woman, "and Berlin," another added quietly. Greta watched their faces, seeing how language was becoming a small window through which they could glimpse America. The country that held them captive was becoming less foreign, less threatening. Words were building invisible bridges, not just between languages, but between worlds at war. November brought a biting chill to Camp Alona, seeping through the thin walls of the barracks where the German women huddled for warmth. The cornfields surrounding the camp had turned brittle and brown, matching the landscape's increasingly harsh demeanor. It was against this backdrop of encroaching winter that Liesl Wagner fell ill. The young woman collapsed during morning roll call, her face flushed with fever. Two of the other prisoners caught her before she hit the ground, and Greta Hoffman immediately took charge, barking orders in both German and her improving English. "Get her to bed! Someone fetch the medic!" The camp doctor, a bespectacled man with a perpetual frown, examined Liesl with clinical detachment. "Influenza, most likely," he announced, prescribing bed rest and plenty of fluids. "Keep her warm and isolated from the others if possible." He left a small bottle of aspirin tablets before departing, his footsteps echoing across the wooden floor. Greta sat beside the young woman's bed, placing a damp cloth on her burning forehead. "You'll be fine," she whispered, though uncertainty tinged her voice. In Germany, before the war, there would have been proper medicine, familiar foods to strengthen the body. Here in this strange place, Liesl seemed suddenly fragile, her usual vibrant energy extinguished by fever. Word of the illness traveled quickly through Camp Alona. Margaret Sullivan arranged for extra blankets to be delivered to the barracks, while the guards kept a respectful distance, their faces betraying concern despite their professional demeanor. Sam Washington heard about Liesl's condition during the lunch service. The cook paused in his work, remembering the young woman's bright eyes and quick smile. She had been the first of the German prisoners to attempt speaking to him in English, awkwardly complimenting his cooking despite the initial cornbread incident. That evening, after the kitchen had emptied, Sam worked alone by lamplight. He crumbled fresh cornbread into a bowl, pouring warm milk over it and stirring in a generous spoonful of honey. His mother had made this same remedy whenever he fell ill as a child in Alabama, calling it strength in a bowl. The simple dish had sustained him through many childhood illnesses. Without fanfare, Sam carried the covered bowl to the women's barracks. The guard at the door, recognizing the cook, allowed him to enter. Sam placed the warm mixture on the small table beside Liesl's bed, nodding briefly to Greta, who watched with surprise in her tired eyes. "For strength," he said simply, his voice low and gentle. Then he turned and left without waiting for thanks or acknowledgement, his footsteps fading into the night. Greta stared at the steaming bowl, inhaling the sweet, comforting aroma. Something in the simple gesture touched her deeply, bridging divides she had thought impassable. Liesl Wagner's fever finally broke after 3 days of restless sleep. She sat up in her cot, pale but smiling. the empty bowl still clutched in her hands. The cornbread, soaked in milk and honey, had been the first thing she'd eaten with any enthusiasm since falling ill. "It tasted like my grandmother's bread pudding," she whispered to Greta Hoffman, who sat beside her bed. "So sweet and comforting." Greta nodded, watching the young woman's face brighten at the memory. Something shifted in her chest, a loosening of the tight knot she'd carried since their arrival. The dish had been left without fanfare, without expectation of thanks, yet it had brought such relief to the youngest of their group. "Sam brought it," another woman whispered from across the room. "I saw him leave it here yesterday." The cook, the man whose food they had mocked that first day. Greta felt a flush of shame creep up her neck as she remembered her own cutting words. She glanced toward the barracks window, where beyond the barbed wire, the Iowa cornfield stretched toward the horizon, now harvested and bare in the November chill. That evening, while the others played cards, Greta sat on her bunk with paper and pencil. She began a letter home as she did each week, but tonight her words flowed differently. "Dearest Mama, the strangest thing has happened. Do you remember I wrote about the yellow bread that wasn't bread at all? I was wrong to dismiss it. When Liesel fell ill, the cook, a Negro man named Sam Washington from Alabama, prepared it specially, soaked in milk and sweetened with honey. It brought her comfort when nothing else would. These Americans have their own ways of showing kindness. Their bread carries the sweetness of their corn, just as ours carries the strength of our rye. Different, yes, but sustaining all the same." She paused, pencil hovering over the paper. How quickly judgment had come to her lips that first day. How easily she had dismissed something unfamiliar as inferior. She thought of Sam working in the kitchen, crafting food that carried memories of his home, only to hear it mocked by strangers. Greta continued writing, describing the taste and texture of the cornbread, the way it had soothed Liesel's fever, the unexpected kindness behind the gesture. For the first time since arriving at Camp Alona, her letter contained no complaints, no bitter observations, only quiet respect for the small bridge between worlds. When she finished, she folded the paper carefully, knowing her words might never reach Germany. But something had changed, regardless. Tomorrow, she decided, she would find a way to thank Sam properly. The late November air carried an unusual energy through Camp Alona. American guards bustled about with heightened enthusiasm, mentioning something called Thanksgiving that left the German women puzzled. Greta Hoffman noticed the mess hall being decorated with paper turkeys and autumn leaves, a curious sight amidst the otherwise austere surroundings. "It's their harvest festival," Greta explained to her companions, drawing on what she'd learned in their English sessions. "Like our Erntedankfest, but with different traditions." The morning of the celebration, Margaret Sullivan visited the barracks personally. "We'd like you all to join us for the Thanksgiving meal," she announced. "It's an important American tradition about gratitude, even in difficult times." Liesel Wagner's eyes lit up at the prospect of special food. "Will there be pie? I've heard the guards talking about pie," she asked eagerly, her growing English vocabulary becoming a source of pride. When afternoon arrived, the women filed into the mess hall, curious about this American ritual. The tables had been arranged differently, creating one long communal space rather than the usual separated sections. Guards and prisoners would dine together, an unprecedented arrangement. Sam Washington stood behind a serving station, his face more relaxed than it had been since the cornbread incident weeks earlier. Steam rose from trays of roasted turkey, potatoes, and a golden brown mixture that caught Greta's attention. "What is this?" she asked, pointing at the unfamiliar dish, as Sam spooned a portion onto her plate. "That's stuffing," he replied. "Cornbread mixed with herbs, onions, and broth. My grandmother's recipe." Greta recognized the yellow crumbles within the mixture, the very same cornbread they had once mocked. She carried her plate to the table, where Liesel and the others waited, feeling a twinge of embarrassment. The young woman took the first brave bite of stuffing, and her expression transformed. "It's wonderful!" she exclaimed. the genuine delight in her voice causing heads to turn. One by one, the German women tasted the cornbread stuffing. What had once seemed alien and worthy of ridicule now brought unexpected comfort. The familiar yet transformed ingredient bridged something within them, a recognition that adaptation could bring pleasure rather than just resignation. Laughter soon filled the mess hall, not the defensive mockery of their first meal, but the warm sound of shared enjoyment. Even the guards seemed to relax, sharing stories about their family Thanksgiving traditions between bites. Margaret watched from the end of the table, catching Greta's eye with a knowing smile. The camp director had understood what this meal could accomplish before anyone else. For one afternoon, the war seemed distant. In its place was something fragile yet powerful, a moment of genuine camaraderie built on the foundation of a simple dish that was no longer foreign but familiar. December arrived at Camp Alona with a bitter wind that cut through the barracks like shards of ice. The holiday spirit that had begun to blossom after Thanksgiving was suddenly frozen by two devastating telegrams that arrived on the same gray morning. Sam Washington was sorting through ingredients for the day's meals when a camp guard approached with an official envelope. His hands trembled as he read that his son, serving with a segregated unit in Europe, was missing in action. The wooden spoon he'd been holding clattered to the floor, the sound echoing in the suddenly silent kitchen. The cook's broad shoulders slumped as he folded the telegram carefully and tucked it into his breast pocket, right against his heart. That same afternoon, Greta Hoffman was summoned to Margaret Sullivan's office. The camp director's face was grave as she handed over the Red Cross telegram. Greta's younger sister had perished in an Allied bombing raid on Hamburg. The former schoolteacher read the words 3 times, as if repetition might somehow change their meaning. When she finally looked up, her eyes were dry but vacant. "Thank you for informing me," she said in careful English, before walking stiffly back to her barracks. For days afterward, both Sam and Greta moved through the camp like ghosts. The cook's usual humming fell silent as he prepared meals with mechanical precision. The German woman withdrew from the English lessons she'd been leading, leaving Liesel Wagner to take over with concerned glances toward her mentor. During meals, Greta would sit alone, pushing food around her plate. Sam would emerge briefly from the kitchen, his gaze sweeping the room before retreating again without a word. Their shared grief, though unacknowledged, hung in the air between them. One evening, as the mess hall emptied, Greta remained at her table, staring at nothing. Sam emerged to collect the dishes and paused near her. Without speaking, he placed a small plate with a piece of warm cornbread beside her hand. "My son used to say it helps," he said quietly, the first words he'd spoken in days. Greta looked up, really seeing him for the first time since their respective news. "My sister loved dark bread," she replied, her voice rough from disuse. "She would save her ration for our mother." Sam nodded, understanding the weight behind her words. No further conversation passed between them, but as they sat in silence, the German prisoner and the American cook, something unspoken bridged the divide. Their losses, oceans apart, yet identical in pain, created a connection that transcended nationality, language, and the barbed wire surrounding Camp Alona. The sky darkened prematurely that mid-December afternoon, heavy clouds rolling in like a gray curtain across Iowa's vast horizon. No one at Camp Alona anticipated the ferocity of the blizzard that descended upon them. By nightfall, winds howled through the barracks, rattling windows and whistling through every crack in the wooden walls. Margaret Sullivan had just finished her evening rounds when the electricity failed. One moment, the dim yellow lights illuminated the camp. The next, darkness enveloped everything, except for the swirling white visible through frosted windows. The temperature plummeted rapidly inside the barracks. "Everyone to the mess hall," Margaret ordered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Bring all blankets and warm clothing." Guards and prisoners alike, stumbled through knee-deep snow, the usual boundaries between them, momentarily forgotten in the face of nature's onslaught. Inside the mess hall, Sam Washington worked frantically to light kerosene lamps, while others pushed tables against the walls to create space in the center of the room. "We need to conserve body heat," one guard explained, his usual authoritative tone replaced by genuine concern. Greta organized the women into a tight circle, counting heads to ensure no one was missing. "Lysol," she called, panic rising in her throat, until she spotted the young woman helping an elderly guard arrange blankets. Hours passed in uncomfortable silence. The building creaked and moaned under the assault of wind and ice. Despite their huddled proximity, the cold seemed to penetrate to their bones. Teeth chattered, and fingers turned blue despite being tucked into armpits and pockets. It was Liesel Wagner who finally broke the tension. Her voice, thin and trembling at first, rose in the darkness. "Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht." The familiar melody of Silent Night hung in the frigid air. For a moment, no one moved or spoke. Then, from across the room, one of the younger guards joined in with the English lyrics. "Silent Night, Holy Night." One by one, voices added to the impromptu choir. Some in German, others in English, creating a haunting harmony that seemed to warm the very air around them. Sam's deep baritone blended with Margaret's clear soprano. Even Greta, usually reserved, found herself singing the words she'd known since childhood. By the third verse, the boundaries that typically divided them, nationality, uniform, language, had temporarily dissolved. They were simply people seeking comfort in a shared human experience, their breath visible in the lamplight, their voices united against the howling storm outside. When the song ended, the silence that followed felt different, not tense or awkward, but peaceful. Someone started another carol, and then another. Through the longest night of the blizzard, music became their shelter, more powerful than walls or blankets against the cold. The January morning frost coated the kitchen windows as Greta Hoffman approached the mess hall, her heart pounding with each step. She had rehearsed what to say, but the words felt clumsy on her tongue. Through the steamy glass, she spotted Sam Washington already at work, his skilled hands moving with practiced precision. "Excuse me," she said, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "I wonder if, that is, could you teach me to make cornbread?" Sam looked up, surprise flickering across his face. The former schoolteacher from Hamburg stood before him, the same woman whose dismissive comment had stung him months ago. He wiped his hands on his apron, considering her request. "Why?" he asked simply. Greta shifted her weight. "Because I was wrong," she admitted, "and because Liesel speaks of nothing else since you helped her recover." After a long moment, Sam nodded and gestured toward an empty workspace. "We start with cornmeal, not wheat flour," he explained, his voice warming slightly as he slid a bowl toward her. Their movements were tentative at first, Greta measuring too precisely, Sam correcting with gentle guidance. "Cooking ain't like building a bridge," he said with the hint of a smile. "Sometimes you need to feel it more than measure it, as butter melted in cast-iron pans." Sam spoke of Montgomery, of his grandmother who taught him to cook during the hardest years. She'd say, "Samuel, hunger don't care what color you are, but good food can make folks forget their differences." Greta listened, dusting flour from her hands. "In Hamburg, bread was everything," she shared. "My sister and I would wait in line for hours." Her voice caught slightly at the mention of her sister, the loss still raw. The cook nodded, understanding grief without words. "My boy's recovering in a hospital in France," he said quietly. "Never thought I'd be feeding the people he was fighting. And I never thought I would be learning from someone." Greta paused, ashamed of what she might have said months earlier. "Someone like me," Sam finished, his eyes knowing. "Someone I had wronged," she corrected, meeting his gaze. They worked in companionable silence after that, the kitchen filled with the sweet aroma of baking cornbread. When Sam finally slid the golden squares onto a plate, he offered the first piece to Greta. She took a bite, closing her eyes. It tastes like... She searched for the words. Like survival. Like hope. Sam Washington nodded, a genuine smile finally breaking through. That's exactly what it is. For one morning, in a kitchen far from their homes, two people divided by war found common ground in cornmeal and butter, creating something that transcended the barbed wire surrounding Camp Alona. Greta Hoffman stood in the center of the barracks, her hands dusted with cornmeal, as she demonstrated the proper mixing technique. The morning after her kitchen session with Sam, she had gathered the courage to share her newfound knowledge with the other women. Not too much stirring, she cautioned, remembering Sam's gentle correction when she'd overmixed the batter. It makes the bread tough. 12 pairs of eyes watched intently as the former schoolteacher applied her instructional skills to this most unlikely subject. They had managed to secure several large bowls from the mess hall, and Margaret Sullivan had surprised them with permission to use the small auxiliary kitchen attached to their barracks. "I still cannot believe we are making this American thing," Liesl Wagner said with a grin, her fingers yellow with cornmeal. The youngest prisoner had recovered fully from her illness and was now the most enthusiastic student. "It's called cornbread," Greta corrected gently, and Sam says his grandmother taught him this recipe during hard times in Alabama. The women worked in pairs, measuring and mixing with borrowed cups and spoons. Laughter erupted when Helga spilled buttermilk down her front, leaving a white streak on her worn dress. For a moment, they were not prisoners, but simply women sharing a domestic task, the war temporarily forgotten. "My mother would never believe this," one woman remarked, carefully pouring batter into a cast-iron pan. German women baking American bread in an Iowa prison camp. The rich, sweet aroma began filling the barracks as the first batch entered the small oven. It was a scent that had become familiar over the months, but now carried new meaning. They were creating it themselves. "Sam says every family has their own version," Greta explained, wiping her hands on a cloth. "Some add sugar, others use honey. His mother added jalapenos, hot peppers," she clarified when met with confused looks. When the golden squares emerged from the oven, steaming and fragrant, a spontaneous cheer rose from the group. They gathered around, breaking off warm pieces and savoring their creation. "It's not German bread," admitted Liesl, "but it's good in its own way." Greta nodded, remembering her dismissive words months earlier. The cornbread had transformed from a strange foreign food to something that brought comfort and pride. As she watched her companions enjoy their handiwork, she realized they were adapting not just recipes, but themselves. That evening, the guards passing by the barracks noted the unusual atmosphere of contentment. The scent of freshly baked cornbread wafted through the winter air, carrying with it something unexpected in a prisoner of war camp. The fragrance of home being recreated in a foreign land. February arrived with a biting chill that swept across Iowa, bringing with it not just snow, but an official Red Cross inspector. Margaret Sullivan had received the telegram just days before, and the entire camp had been in a flurry of preparation. Greta Hoffman helped organize the German women, ensuring their quarters were presentable while trying to calm their nerves. "They're not here to judge us," she assured Liesl, who was anxiously straightening her bunk for the third time. "They just need to verify we're being treated properly." The inspector, a stern woman named Eleanor Blackwood, arrived precisely at 9 in the morning. With clipboard in hand and accompanied by 2 assistants, she began her methodical evaluation of Camp Alona. The camp director walked beside her, answering questions with practiced diplomacy as they moved from barracks to facilities. What began as a formal inspection gradually shifted into something unexpected. Eleanor noticed the German women and American guards conversing in mixed English and German, exchanging small jokes rather than suspicious glances. In the mess hall, she observed prisoners and staff sitting together during breaks, sharing stories over steaming cups of coffee. "This is unusual," Eleanor remarked, making notes. "Most camps maintain strict separation. We've found understanding builds better security than fear," Margaret responded. The inspection reached its most revealing moment when they entered the kitchen. Sam Washington was teaching 3 German women how to properly season cornbread batter. The women were laughing, flour dusting their aprons as they worked alongside the cook. "What's happening here?" Eleanor asked, genuinely curious. Greta stepped forward, wiping her hands on her apron. "We're learning American cooking," she explained. "It began with cornbread, something we once mocked but now appreciate." Sam nodded, a small smile crossing his face. "Cultural exchange goes both ways. They've taught me a few German recipes too." Eleanor spent the afternoon interviewing prisoners privately, expecting complaints or reports of mistreatment. Instead, she heard stories of transformation, how a simple misunderstanding about bread had evolved into genuine respect and cultural appreciation. Before departing, the inspector pulled Margaret aside. "What you've accomplished here could be significant," she said. "This cornbread story, it's precisely the kind of human connection people need to hear about right now." As the Red Cross vehicle disappeared down the snowy road, Greta stood beside Margaret on the porch of the administration building. "Will this help others understand?" the German woman asked quietly. Margaret nodded, watching the horizon. "Stories like ours remind people that even in war, humanity can prevail. Sometimes it just takes a piece of bread to start the conversation." News of Camp Alona's unusual harmony traveled swiftly through military channels. What began as routine reports caught the attention of senior officers, who marveled at how a simple misunderstanding over cornbread had transformed into something remarkable. By early March, the Red Cross representative who had visited the camp returned with an unusual request for Greta Hoffman. "We'd like you to write about your experience here," the woman explained, handing Greta a leather-bound notebook. "For our publication, something honest about how perspectives can change, even in wartime." Greta sat alone that evening, pen hovering over blank paper. How could she capture this journey? She began hesitantly, describing that first day when they'd laughed at the strange yellow squares. "The former teacher wrote through the night, crossing out lines, starting again, determined to honor what had happened with truth. We mocked what we did not understand," she wrote, "and in doing so, we wounded those who had shown us only kindness. The cornbread we ridiculed was not just food. It carried history, family, and identity. Sam's recipe was his heritage, his home, his heart offered on a plate." She described their transformation, how illness and Liesel's recovery had opened their eyes, how a blizzard had forced them together, and how learning to bake had built bridges stronger than any military treaty. "Bread, in any form, is more than sustenance," her conclusion read. "It is communion. It is the breaking down of walls between strangers." What began as not even bread became the very thing that made us human to each other again. When Margaret Sullivan read the finished essay, she squeezed Greta's hand wordlessly, eyes bright with emotion. The camp director arranged for the piece to be read aloud during dinner, with Sam translating sections for those still learning English. The mess hall fell silent as Greta's words filled the space. Several guards discreetly wiped their eyes. Liesel beamed with pride at her mentor. Even the most stoic prisoners nodded in recognition of their shared journey. Sam Washington stood at the back, arms folded across his chest, face unreadable until the final lines. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded, the highest praise he could offer. The Red Cross published the essay the following week, distributing it to camps across America and Europe. Letters arrived from other facilities, from officials, even from families back home who had received copies. "You've captured something essential," Margaret told Greta afterward. "Something the world desperately needs to remember when this war finally ends." That night, Greta added a postscript to her personal diary. "Perhaps peace begins not with grand treaties, but with the humble admission that what seems foreign may simply be unfamiliar, and that bread, by any name, can nourish more than the body. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning, clutched in Margaret Sullivan's hands, as she made her way across the frosted grounds to the kitchen. Sam Washington stood at his usual post, kneading dough with practiced movements that betrayed nothing of his inner turmoil. The past weeks had been a purgatory of uncertainty, since learning his son was missing in action. "Sam," Margaret called softly, extending the paper. "News from the front." His flour-dusted hands trembled as he read the words. His boy was alive, wounded, but alive in a field hospital in France. The relief crashed through him like a wave, leaving him breathless against the counter. "Thank the Lord," he whispered, pressing the telegram to his chest. The joy was immediate but incomplete. Wounded how badly? When would he come home? Questions without answers clouded his momentary peace. Word traveled quickly through Camp Alona. By afternoon, Greta Hoffman had heard about Sam's news. The schoolteacher hesitated outside the kitchen door that evening, remembering her own telegram from December, the one that had stolen her sister forever. She understood the complicated relief of partial good news during wartime. "May I come in?" she asked in careful English, her accent still thick, but her intention clear. Sam looked up, nodding silently. The kitchen after hours was his sanctuary, but tonight he welcomed the company. Greta moved to the stove, where a pot simmered. "I lost my sister to the bombs," she said simply. "But your son lives. This is good." "He's hurt," Sam replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Don't know how bad." "But he breathes," Greta said. "This is everything." They worked side by side without further words, Sam stirring his stew, Greta slicing the day's leftover cornbread. The silence between them wasn't awkward, but companionable, built on the foundation of shared understanding that transcended their differences. When they finally sat across from each other at the small prep table, steam rising between them, words weren't necessary. The cook served 2 bowls while Greta arranged the cornbread slices. They ate together, the simple meal a communion of sorts. "My Heinrich was a good student," Greta finally said, breaking the silence. "Your son, what is he like?" Sam's face softened. "James has his mother's laugh and my stubborn chin. Wanted to be a teacher before the war." "Like me," Greta smiled faintly. "Like you," Sam agreed, meeting her eyes across the table. Neither mentioned the irony that their countries were still at war, that Sam's son had been wounded fighting Greta's countrymen. In this moment, they were simply 2 parents bound by worry and hope, sharing bread in a quiet kitchen while the Iowa wind howled outside. With Margaret Sullivan's enthusiastic blessing, the English lessons in Camp Alona evolved into something far more meaningful. Greta Hoffman stood before her fellow prisoners not just as their English teacher, but as a cultural ambassador. The classroom, a corner of the barracks with mismatched chairs and a small blackboard, had become a place of discovery. "Today, we learn American expressions," Greta announced, writing "raining cats and dogs" on the board. The women exchanged puzzled glances. "It means heavy rain," she explained, "not actual animals falling from the sky." The room erupted in laughter. Liesel Wagner, always quick to participate, raised her hand. "In Germany, we say it's raining pitchforks. Americans must love their pets more than farm tools." These moments of connection happened daily now. What had begun as basic language instruction had blossomed into cultural exchange. Greta taught them about American measurements, cups instead of grams, and the strange names for food that had once seemed so alien: grits, hush puppies, and of course, cornbread. The women gathered eagerly for these lessons, their initial wariness replaced by genuine curiosity. They practiced American slang, discussed differences in social customs, and even attempted to understand baseball after one of the guards explained the rules. In America, Greta told them one evening, "They smile at strangers. It doesn't mean they're simple-minded. It's considered polite. No wonder they thought us cold," remarked an older prisoner who had once refused to participate in lessons. "I've been scowling at kindness for months." the teacher found herself learning alongside her students. Each day brought new discoveries: American optimism, their casual friendliness, their habit of asking, "How are you?" without expecting a detailed answer. These small cultural differences, once sources of confusion and judgment, now fascinated the women. Margaret occasionally observed these sessions, standing quietly at the back of the room. She noticed how Greta had adopted some of her own diplomatic skills, mediating between German traditions and American ways with growing confidence. "You've created something remarkable here," the camp director told Greta after one particularly lively lesson about American holidays. "This is how peace begins, with understanding." Greta nodded, thinking of her journey from scorn to appreciation. "We came here thinking we knew everything worth knowing," she replied softly. "Now we realize how much there is to learn." The women continued gathering each evening, finding joy in these small everyday wonders that had once seemed so foreign. Their notebooks filled with new words, recipes, and customs, precious knowledge they would carry home when the war finally ended. In the heart of Iowa, far from the ruins of their homeland, they were building bridges of understanding, one American expression at a time. In the soft light of a late February afternoon, Greta Hoffman gathered the women in the barracks. Paper and pencils had been distributed by Margaret Sullivan, who stood quietly by the door, observing with a small smile of approval. "Today we write home differently," Greta announced, her voice steady but gentle. "Not about our hardships, but about what we've learned, what we've come to appreciate." The women exchanged uncertain glances. For months, their letters had carried complaints, longing, and bitterness. This new approach felt foreign, yet somehow necessary. Liesel was the first to begin writing, her pencil moving swiftly across the page. "I'm telling them about the cornbread," she said, looking up with bright eyes. "How we laughed at first, but now I dream of teaching my mother to make it when I return." Around the room, pencils began to scratch against paper. Greta moved between the bunks, offering encouragement and suggestions. One woman described the blizzard night when songs had bridged two languages. Another wrote about Sam's kitchen, how the American cook had shown more dignity in silence than many showed with 1,000 words. "My sister would have loved the honey-soaked cornbread," Greta whispered to herself as she returned to her own letter. She wrote about transformation, about finding humanity in unexpected places. The words flowed easily now, carrying truth rather than resentment. From her position by the door, the camp director watched with quiet satisfaction. These letters would travel across the Atlantic, carrying seeds of reconciliation to a country still engulfed in flames and fury. "Do you think they'll understand?" asked one of the older women, hesitating over her page. "Back home, they're still being told Americans are the enemy." Greta paused, considering. "Perhaps not immediately, but someday, when the fighting stops?" These words might help rebuild what's been broken. As evening approached, 12 letters lay ready for mailing, 12 testaments to growth amid confinement. They contained recipes for cornbread, descriptions of Iowa snowfalls, and stories of small kindnesses that had sustained them through winter. "I've written that bread comes in many forms," Liesel announced proudly, "and that sometimes what nourishes us most is what we least expect." Greta collected the letters, feeling their weight, not just paper and ink, but hope traveling across an ocean to a homeland they barely recognized in their memories anymore. These messages carried something precious, proof that even in war's shadow, humanity could flourish over a simple meal of what was once dismissed as not even bread. The late February sun cast longer shadows across Camp Alona as the first hints of spring whispered through Iowa's still frosty landscape. Inside the camp kitchen, Greta Hoffman stood with flour-dusted hands, carefully measuring cornmeal into a large mixing bowl. Around her, several of the German women watched intently as she demonstrated the technique Sam Washington had taught her months before. "The secret," Greta explained, is not to overmix. American cornbread isn't meant to be kneaded like our bread back home. Liesl Wagner nodded eagerly, already experimenting by adding dried herbs she had carefully saved from previous meals. The youngest prisoner had become the most adventurous with recipes, fearlessly combining German cooking methods with their new American staple. "I'm adding caraway seeds to mine," announced Liesl, her eyes bright with anticipation. "Like my mother's rye bread from Dresden." The kitchen had become their sanctuary, a place where national boundaries dissolved into the simple pleasure of creation. What had once been mockery, "It's not even bread," had transformed into a canvas for innovation. The women folded grated apples into the batter, sprinkled in cinnamon, or added cheese and herbs for savory variations. Sam watched from the doorway, arms crossed but with unmistakable pride in his expression. The former schoolteacher had become an unexpected ambassador of his family's Southern cooking tradition. He nodded approvingly as the women worked, occasionally offering a suggestion but mostly allowing them to make the recipe their own. Mealtimes had evolved from silent, perfunctory affairs into lively gatherings. The long tables in the mess hall now hosted impromptu storytelling sessions, with both prisoners and guards contributing tales from their childhoods. Margaret Sullivan had noticed the change, documenting it in her reports as evidence of successful rehabilitation. "My grandmother would never believe this," Greta remarked one evening as the women shared a particularly successful batch topped with honey. "That I would find comfort in American food in an Iowa prison camp." "Yet here we are," replied Liesl, breaking off a warm piece, "finding home in strange places." The guards, too, had begun requesting the German-American fusion creations. One young soldier from California regularly traded cigarettes for pieces of what the women now called Bavarian cornbread. Cornbread with a hint of nutmeg and a streusel-like topping. As they gathered around the communal table, the golden squares of cornbread represented more than sustenance. They embodied resilience, the ability to adapt, to find sweetness amid bitterness, to create something new from the collision of worlds. The women had transformed their initial scorn into a tradition that sustained not just their bodies but their spirits. In the heart of winter's end, they had discovered that survival sometimes tasted like cornbread, humble, unexpected, and surprisingly sweet. As the harsh Iowa winter began to soften into early spring, Camp Alona received an unexpected visit from Brigadier General Howard Miller. The camp fell into formation, German prisoners and American guards alike standing at attention as the general's vehicle rolled through the gates. Margaret Sullivan greeted him with quiet confidence, knowing what the camp had achieved went far beyond military protocol. General Miller had come with a purpose: to officially recognize Camp Alona for its exemplary humanitarian record during wartime, a distinction rarely given to prisoner facilities. In times of global conflict, the general announced to the assembled crowd, "We often forget our common humanity. Camp Alona stands as testament to what can be achieved when compassion guides even our most difficult decisions." Margaret stood tall as she accepted the commendation, her vision for the camp finally vindicated. She had faced criticism from military superiors who believed her approach too lenient, but the results spoke volumes. Not a single escape attempt, minimal conflict, and prisoners who would return to Germany with stories not of American cruelty, but of unexpected kindness. Sam Washington received special recognition for his role in fostering understanding. The cook stood awkwardly in the spotlight, unused to such attention, especially from military brass. His cornbread, once the subject of mockery, had become the unlikely symbol of the camp's transformation. "Food speaks when words fail," Sam said simply when asked to comment, his eyes finding Greta Hoffman's in the crowd. The ceremony's most powerful moment came when Greta's essay for the Red Cross publication was read aloud. Her words flowed across the assembly ground, describing the journey from scorn to appreciation, from suspicion to trust. "We came as enemies, carrying the weight of propaganda and fear," her essay concluded. We leave as witnesses to the power of small kindnesses. A piece of cornbread taught us more about America than any victory could have. It showed us that even in war, humanity endures. Hardened soldiers blinked back unexpected emotion. The German women stood straighter, their faces reflecting pride rather than the defeated resignation common in other camps. Even the usually stoic guards seemed moved by the recognition of their collective achievement. As the ceremony concluded, Margaret caught Greta's eye across the yard and nodded slightly. This was their shared legacy, proof that even in humanity's darkest hour, connection remained possible. The camp's story would be documented in military records, but its true impact would live on in the hearts of those who had experienced this remarkable transformation. What had begun with laughter at an unfamiliar food had evolved into something profound, a blueprint for reconciliation in a world desperate for healing. The early March sun streamed through the windows of Camp Alona's kitchen, where Greta Hoffman stood surrounded by her 11 companions. Their hands worked methodically, mixing cornmeal, flour, and buttermilk in large metal bowls. This wasn't just any batch of cornbread, it was their farewell offering. More sugar, Liesl Wagner suggested, her once thin face now fuller after months of proper meals. Sam always says the secret is in the sweetness. Greta nodded, watching as the youngest of their group measured carefully. 6 months ago, they had laughed at this strange American creation. Now, they prepared it with reverence, each woman adding her own touch, a pinch of nutmeg, a dash of vanilla, blending their German sensibilities with their new American knowledge. Sam Washington entered carrying fresh eggs, pausing at the doorway to observe the scene. His weathered face broke into a smile as he watched the women work. The telegram about his son's recovery still rested in his pocket, a reminder that even in war, miracles happened. "You've mastered it better than most Alabamians," he said, placing the eggs on the counter. The former schoolteacher looked up, meeting his eyes with quiet understanding. "We had an excellent teacher." Outside, Margaret Sullivan was finalizing release papers. The war wasn't over, but these women would soon be transferred to work programs rather than remain prisoners. The camp director glanced through the kitchen window, satisfied at the transformation she had witnessed. By noon, the mess hall filled with both prisoners and guards. The golden squares of cornbread sat proudly at the center of each table, steam rising into the chilly Iowa air. Greta stood, her posture straight but her expression soft. "When we arrived, we knew nothing of America except what propaganda told us," she began, her English now fluent and confident. "We laughed at your cornbread because it wasn't what we knew. Now we understand that survival isn't just about food, it's about opening our hearts to what seems foreign." Around the room, heads nodded. A guard who had once kept stern distance now wiped away a tear. Liesl distributed the warm squares, her movements graceful and assured. As they ate together, stories flowed freely, of homes left behind, of lessons learned, of small kindnesses that had bridged impossible divides. Margaret shared her vision for the camp's future, while Sam quietly described how his grandmother's cornbread recipe had traveled from slavery to freedom. When the meal ended, embraces replaced formal handshakes. Addresses were exchanged, promises made to write. Greta pressed a handwritten recipe into Sam's palm, while he offered her a small sack of cornmeal for her journey. In the heart of America's heartland, 12 German women had arrived as enemies and would depart as ambassadors of understanding. Their transformation, sparked by a humble square of cornbread, proved that even in war's darkest hours, humanity could find nourishment in the most unexpected places.